Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Dear listener, I hope you're well. In the Northern Hemisphere, this time of year always has the sense of fresh beginnings with the start of the new school year, and also with endings as we move from summer towards the traditional end of the year, the darker months, and the threshold of Samhain. And I also note that our listeners in the Southern Hemisphere will now be moving out of winter towards the spring and a sense of new beginnings. For me, it ends the first week of my stepping into creating this podcast full-time and giving healings, which feels great. There are some interesting projects in the pipeline, including a forthcoming return trip to Woollerton Park with my fellow Gnometeers, Kate Ray and Neil Rushton. We are, of course, researching the case of the Woollerton Gnomes, and I believe Simon Young will be releasing an updated version of that book sometime soon. It's been incredible to see how many folks have joined us lately on Patreon, and I welcome Wendy, Hayley, Diane, Selma, Elizabeth, Cheryl, Jade and Joel at the Weird Folk and Curious Enchanters tiers. Huge thanks to all my supporters, the Curious crew, and I look forward to meeting many of you on Wednesday at our monthly Zoom chat, which features a presentation by Ratfunk on the use of sigils. Really excited for that, and it's a great time of year for ritualistic practice, so a refresher on these techniques is always welcome. Now on to this episode, and I feel it's one of those shares that will stay with you. There are so many interesting experiences here, including childhood levitation, a bedroom-based fairy visitation, a multiple witness sighting of a tiny being disappearing into a hedge, as well as a number of reports of orbs inside a home and lights in trees. And there's a strange case of a fairy-related text message which the sender had not written. In the bonus episode, our guest shares her experience of a stick man being, which her husband also became familiar with. This happened in New York, and the initial experiences happened in the southeast of England. I hold a special place in my heart for these stick being or tree folk creatures, having seen one myself a number of years ago, and having now spoken to others who've encountered them. They appear to be sensitive, peaceful beings who are connected with the land in which they appear, and are perhaps even guardians of that land. If you have encountered one of these stick or tree beings, I would love to hear from you. These descriptions are helping to form a picture of their activities and their particular characters and personalities. If you'd like to hear that bonus, hop over to Patreon, where you can join the community and support the show. As always, you can follow me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com. That's Scarlet with 2 T's and Fae is F-A-E. And follow me on Twitter and Instagram at _remain_curious. I'm sadly still rubbish at Twitter, and I tend to be on Instagram more. You can also visit scarletofthefae.com, where you'll find the show notes and a contact form. I will be back at the end for a quick chat. Well, actually, in fact, it's rather a long chat, because I'm going to be sharing some excerpts from the fairy census that align with the kinds of experiences that our guest shared here. So enjoy this wonderful share. Many thanks to our guest for being so open about her experiences. Time to
I've just always been somebody that has known that there's other I've definitely believed that, there's magic in the world. And I know, from when you're first conscious of the stories that your parents read, my dad read Enid Blyton and, the Enchanted Wood and all those kinds of things. So,
Yeah.
you could say that, those ideas and everything were all part of, my consciousness and growing up. I definitely remember I have some weird things that I look back and I'm like, did they happen? Like I remember being in the garden when I was maybe 4 or 5, and I remember meeting someone and flying up to a tree and getting a pear.
Wow.
Weird, but yeah,
Yeah.
I I don't know. I don't know what that was. Could be a dream, and spoken to my parents about it, latterly, and they're like, yeah, no, that must have been a dream. That can't have happened, but it seems very real.
Was that the daytime?
Was the daytime, yeah. And because I'm that generation where your parents put you outside to play.
Yeah. Yeah.
You went outside all day. So, I was outside wandering around. We had fences and stuff, and grew up on a farm, basically, small holding,
Oh, yeah.
in the middle of a marsh. The house itself, my parents, added lots of new parts to it, but the core of the house is really quite old. There's a kind of a part of it that the foundations are flint. So it
Oh
obviously
my
goes through that.
goodness. Do you know how old it might be then?
Well, no, we've got the deeds kind of way back, but in more recent years, I found out that there was an ancient Saxon, very important Saxon burial ground just around the corner where we lived, and it's surrounded by water. It's marshy. It's used to go across the marsh and just sit on one of the bridges and watch the river and feel watched. There were a few trees that we used to, when I was about 5, I had a little sister. And so when she was old enough to toddle around with me, this would have been a bit later, we used to go off adventuring. And the part of the property I'm talking about now is actually over a lane. So to cross the lane, we used to call it going over the road. So we used to go over the road and play out in the meadows and go fishing. And there were 2 or 3 trees that we decided were fairy trees, and we used to make little fairy houses and put offerings and things like that. And sometimes we took food, and I don't know where we got that idea from. We'd leave them a little biscuit or something.
Yeah.
And the age we were, I've read that that's what people do now, but the age we were, I wouldn't have read anything where people did that, or my parents wouldn't have taught me that. So I don't know where we got that idea that that's what we should do. One of these trees, it's like a very gnarly kind of thorn tree, and I always go and see it when I go home. But I remember it being full of lights, and there being little people in there, in these lights in the tree. Again, it would have been daylight, not even, because we weren't allowed to wander around it, in the dark, but maybe it was kind of sunset kind of time. And again, don't know if that was a dream, don't know if that was real.
And how old would you have been then? Is this sort of around the same age of sort of?
That would have been when my sister was toddling around. So I probably would have been more like 8 or 9, around that sort of time, I would think. But I think it was from about I was asking Mum, I was like, when was it that I was obsessed with having fairy curtains and bedding and things like that? I wanted a fairy room, and it was when we had an extension built on the house, and that was when I was about 5, and I was allowed to pick, the theme for my room, and I wanted fairies. I was very specific. I remember it took such a long time to find fairy fabric, and I ended up with this fabric that was more of a grown-up sort of. When I think of it, the colours were more, kind of. It was like Art Nouveau kind of look. There was all the fairies were all kind of together in amongst all these tendrils and things, so you had to kind of look to see them, to see their faces.
But that sounds really cool.
It was very cool, and but I suppose fairies aren't that unusual for little girls to want, but obviously at the time it was, because you just couldn't get fabric with fairies on like
not like you can now. That's it. When you were really little and you had this memory of kind of going up towards a pear tree, do you remember anything else about that at all?
It's very vague. I remember there was, I met someone. I couldn't tell you. I think it was a female, and it was more like a presence as opposed to I couldn't really describe that person, or even if it was really a person. Mm-hmm. But I remember wanting the pear in the tree, and then that the person made me able to.
Right. So you sort of flew up to it to get the pear and came back down. Did you have the pear? Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I met the pear, and I know where the pear tree was in the garden. I remember that pear tree, and I used to always try and get the low ones when I was little. But yeah. It was only a smallish tree, so I wasn't flying that high. But I do remember, and I didn't come straight back down either. I did kind of fly, fly a little bit across the garden. Sort of, I remember looking down and thinking, oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, lots of children do have memories of flying. They, and I have those memories too. So, lots of us do remember this.
So do you think it's a skill that we all had and we've lost, or do you think it's a gift that's given in a moment, of fun, or when you want something, or you're in the right place at the right time, or?
I think it is something we all have. That's my feeling. I mean, I don't know, but I know that I used to do that regularly, not sort of every day, but I remember doing that a number of times. Mm-hmm. So I say regularly, it's not regularly really. I suppose I don't remember how often it happened, but as a 3 to 4 year old, because we were 4 when we left that house, I have memories of being in that house and flying. So I think, lots of people do have that memory of being able to fly.
That would be the age. It would have been pre going to primary school, and you go to primary school when you're 5, don't you? So the flying, or was it 4? But yeah, it would have been before primary school, I think. So that exact age.
Yeah. And with the lights in the tree, what do you remember about that?
I just remember the tree being very busy, just full of life, and the white lights, not coloured lights, and just round, kind of, soft at the edges, kind of twinkle lights, almost like we don't get them in England, but like a firefly kind of, or a glowworm, that kind of lights like that. But I mean, that could easily have been a dream, because we did always leave offerings and things for the fairies, and so that was probably in my mind, what I imagined, that at night the tree would come alive and they would come and get whatever we'd left them, and the tree would be active. But again, I don't know that you really remember dreams in that way. I can't think, there's maybe a few repeated dreams that you remember, the gist of them, but I don't know, it's clear imagery. It's like the gnome, that I saw in my head.
Yes, that's a really interesting one. Just before we kind of move to the gnome, if you think back to the tree now and that memory, or even, perhaps we'll stick with the tree. What's the sense of it that you get now when you look back, and do you feel it anywhere in your body?
Yeah, it's joy and wonder. Definitely not scary at all. I've never felt threatened or unwanted by any of the fae or others that were around my home at all. Later in life, I've definitely had different kind of experiences, like overstepping, but then maybe it's because, we were leaving offerings and we were respectful of them, and almost, I suppose, leaving offerings is almost like a worship, isn't it, of a kind, which I'm sure they probably appreciated. And they did let me see them for that reason. I couldn't give you details of what they looked like or what they were wearing.
No, but I think it's interesting just to kind of have a sense of the feeling it brings, because that's kind of what stays with you, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's often what's quite striking as adults. Sometimes we do get glimpses of that joy and wonder again through nature, don't we? If we're out, walking somewhere, or we're struck by. Yeah.
That's definitely here for me. It's dolphins, because I see dolphins a lot here, and I just never get bored of it. They are magical creatures. I went on a walk a week ago to do a dolphin spot and to learn from the Marine Mammal Network about them and their protection and everything. And they popped up in this place where they always are, and I've seen them a million times. And I said to the person next to me, like, I'll never get bored. It is amazing. And he said, it's absolutely magical, isn't it? I was like, yes, it is. There is something really magical about certain things in nature, and dolphins are one. Dolphins are one.
I absolutely love them as well. Where I'm from in Jersey, they often appear around the coast in their pods. We went down on a beach one night and we were doing a ritual. I think it was before we did the ritual, we were preparing for one, and we walked down to the water, and there, not very far out, were this pod of dolphins that had come in, and it was just such a beautiful blessing. And I mean, you can go on trips and stuff that I've not done that, and I'd love to do that. But yeah, just for them to come in and have a bit of a nose.
No, they do. They're very curious, and
they are
interesting creatures, and I'm sure they can sense intent as well. That good feeling that you get in nature. And I did actually. So when I went to primary school from the age of about 5, I became best friends with a girl I'm still friends with now. And so I had the kind of, the traditional country farmhouse kind of home on the marsh. And her father was a gamekeeper. And so she lived in a cottage in the middle of the woods. So we would spend weekends at my house, or Sundays were the day that we would, play at each other's houses, or at her house. And she had obviously not all year round, but part of the woods was a beautiful bluebell woods that we used to go to and hang out and spend time. And I did actually contact her to say, what are your memories of that? And I still believe in fairies, and I'm going to talk to somebody about that. And she wrote back, not necessarily are they real things exactly, but your feelings around the fae, the magic of the woods, and our experiences. So that's what she feels is that magic. And she said, my thoughts on whether fairies are a real thing. Well, I don't think that specifically, but I do deeply believe in the power of nature, woodland spirits, and the feelings of the woods. For me, woods and nature feel like the natural spiritual places in the world. It wouldn't shock me to see a fairy wandering around in that environment. The woods feel like magic. I think they are magic. And yes, those spaces are entirely wrapped up in my childhood and youth. There were never spaces quite so magical.
Oh, lovely. And how old did you say you were at the time?
So we were
when you were about 5. Yeah,
we were 5, and we
still quite wee. Yeah.
Yeah, all the way through primary school, we were best friends. So when we left at 10 or 11, we were still spending time in the bluebell woods and looking for fairies.
So what happened in the woods then?
Well, that's it. We never actually really. That's what I was trying to get from her. Like, do you remember seeing anything? But no, she just remembers the feeling of the magic, and that's what I remember as well.
Yeah.
It just was, and we kept going. I mean, we were into nature, so we were looking for wildlife, and we would, note the fungus we found and things like that as well. But we were always expecting something other. And we were also quite into, mysteries of the world and ghosts and things like that as we got a little bit older. And there was a little churchyard on the estate where her house was, where there was a little girl was buried that had been the previous gamekeeper's daughter. And we formed quite an attachment with her and used to put flowers on her grave. And I think we always part expected to see her. In fact, I did say that she had seen her in her room a couple of times, but again, I
Gosh,
don't
yeah.
know whether that was her or imagination, or I don't know. But what my thoughts are is that where I grew up and where we both spent our time together, those are, I call them thin places.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm not the only person that calls them thin
Yeah.
places.
Yeah. No, you're not.
The layers are very thin between, I don't know whether it's between times, between realms, but there's always that feeling. And I was really interested, I think I was in my 20s when I found out about the Saxon burial site very close to where I live, because I always had that feeling of something very ancient and very old being there, but close by.
Yeah.
The layer wasn't very far away, kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Did the gnome experience happen in that house as well?
Yes, yes.
What happened in that situation?
Well, that I just remember. I think I'd been reading, like very like the chap in your podcast. I think I'd been reading, and this is the thing. I may have nodded off and woken up, because I used to always read till late, and my dad would come up just before they were going to bed and say, "Right, lights out, time to go to bed." And I was either reading or had just woken up having been reading, and I looked down, and I was kind of like half out of my duvets, and the duvet was kind of like rocked up, and this it was traditional little man in a pointed red cap was running across my bedding, like, and it was sort of up and over my knees, and I was trying to catch him. And my dad came in to say, lights out, time to, go to bed, go to sleep. And he asked me what I was doing. And I said, there's a gnome in my bed. I'm trying to catch it. And he said, oh, I think you must be dreaming. And that was that I didn't see, he vanished. The gnome vanished. Obviously, my dad didn't see the gnome. And then obviously I was very definitely awake. And
Yeah.
and my dad was saying, no, it was a dream. There's no gnomes in here.
I'm not going to start entertaining the idea that gnomes are real right at this very moment. Thank you very much.
And then, then the next day I remember asking about it. And then, it was always like, you were definitely dreaming. And, unfortunately, my dad passed away several years ago, but I had asked him about it again. And, as an adult, and he had said, no, you were dreaming. You were definitely dreaming. But yes, he did remember the incident as well. So
yeah. What did the gnome look like to you? And did you get eye contact with it?
So I don't remember it making eye contact with me, because I feel like it had a bag or something that, like a sack, that it was like something it had collected, and it like I'd caught it collecting something. I don't know. I don't know. There wasn't a tooth fairy, and I didn't have a tooth under the pillow, so it wasn't a tooth fairy. And it was not at that end of the bed. It was kind of, over my legs. But my recollection of him, I say, is it's a very traditional gnome with a beard, pointed red hat, maybe a blue kind of shirt or blue pants, or some sort of blue, and quite stocky, quite a stocky little fellow. Kind of, I remember him kind of struggling up, because I had quite a big duvet, kind of struggling up and over the duvet. But it was he was surprised, maybe surprised that I could see him. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be seeing him. Maybe he came every night. Maybe he continued to come every night, and I don't know. But that was just the one instance that I did see him.
How big was he?
Quite small. I don't know, 4 inches.
Oh, really tiny.
Really small, really very small.
Yes.
Yeah, because he was struggling on the duvet and everything. He was a little one. My sister, she had a thing about gnomes, and she had a gnome. She called him her birthday gnome, and she said he was tall, because she had this idea that she had stepped back into him a few times. He had a very pointed nose, and it would and the nose would stick into her back or her side or whatever. And she went, oh, sorry, because he was like watching whatever she was doing in the garden.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
We had animals. My sister and I, our animals. We kept the geese and the chickens and the ducks. So we were outside with with those animals, doing the water and the food and that all the time, that sort of thing all the time as we grew up. And I was actually listening to the podcast. Was it yesterday? The one with the two ladies that have taken over while you're looking after your and they were talking about gnomes and
Kate and Claire.
That's it. And they were talking about gnomes and piskies, and they were saying how gnomes love animals. And I was thinking, oh, yeah, that makes sense that they were, around making sure probably that we were, looking after the animals properly. But for some reason, one decided to tag around by my sister. So it was a bigger one than the one I had seen.
And she felt quite happy in its presence then.
Yeah, she was never worried about the gnomes at all.
Yeah.
No.
And so the gnome incident, was that, how old were you then?
It's hard to say. I definitely would have been at primary school. So the trouble, isn't it? So things kind of blend together in age.
It is. When you've stayed in the same house as well throughout your childhood, there's no cut-off points. Because for me, I always date things from which house we were in, so I can imagine how hard it is.
My mum is still in that house, and
right.
I'm trying to remember what the bedding was that I had. I would say I was probably about 6 or 7. I don't think I would have. It wasn't when I was little, and it was when I was reading by myself.
You were reading. Yeah.
Staying up late reading things, and so I would think I must have been that kind of age. I think 6 or 7, because I think that's probably more likely.
Do you remember any sound at all from him?
No. And I wasn't frightened of him either. I was curious. I wanted to catch him. But then that probably is the kind of person that I am. I do like, I've always been a, catch wildlife and study it kind of person. I'm curious. So perhaps that was my thought, like, oh, pick it up and pet it kind of. Yeah, I don't know why my instinct was to try and catch it. But it wasn't fear at all. And and then I was just confused when it had gone, and I was so sure that he had been there.
Yeah, that's great. I wonder what he was up to.
Yeah,
sounds like he was up to something.
I think so. But my room is on the end of the house where there's a big wisteria plant that grows up, and actually it would have been smaller then, because that part of the house is the new part of the house. But I always thought that creatures would come up the wisteria and through my window, and I did used to keep my window open in the summer, for fresh air, and they could come and into the window. And I just remember something else about that wisteria as well. So this is a weird thing. So this is jumping like way forward. This was like last year or possibly the year before. My mum was airing out my my bedroom because I was coming to visit, and she said, she messaged me and said she had all the windows open and everything. I said, well, be careful, Mum, or the fairies will come in. And I got a message back, and I can't remember. It said something like, is that bad, or something like that. And then my mum wrote and said, I didn't write that.
Oh.
She said, that's
funny.
Really, I didn't write that. And then I did ask her about it again recently, and she had forgotten, and I found the text. So I'll have to go back and find the text. But somebody wrote back something along the lines of, is that a bad thing? Or and it wasn't her.
This is so I've heard of instances of this.
I didn't know they used technology, but So there you are. But I tell you, that wisteria is rife with them, and if ever I'm home now as an adult, if ever the lights come, I probably sound like a crazy person how the lights come, but it's from that side of the room where the wisteria is. There's definitely I don't know whether they live in there or whether that's how they come up, and I don't know, but that wisteria definitely has something that they like.
So did you say that you're still experiencing the lights now?
Not so. My most recent one, most recent light was, again, I was in my bed, and I was just about to go to sleep, and I saw this light, and it came from the window to the left of my bed where the wisteria is, and it came through there, and it went up onto the curtain rail opposite my bed, and I could see it, and it was kind of winking in and out, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
it was there all the time, but it was getting bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller. And I sat up in bed and I said, "Oh, you again." And it went underneath my bed, and my whole bed shook, and then it disappeared.
Oh
And that
my
was it.
goodness. Yeah. So a real acknowledgement then. Was that,
Yeah.
how did you feel about that?
Um, I just remember thinking, oh, fairies. And I don't feel worried or concerned about that now. I just think, yeah, that's just, they're around. And I think there were times when I did feel afraid when I was a child. And I put it down to ghosts, but I'm wondering now whether it was them.
Mm.
So say I never felt afraid around the Fae, but I did feel afraid in the house. And I did think it was ghosts, but maybe it was ghosts, because there's definitely something, or was something other than Fae in that house, I think. So
Yeah.
I don't know. They are mischievous for sure.
Yeah. Has your mum ever noticed anything happening? Because I know you were walking in the woods one time with her when you both experienced something together,
Yeah.
didn't you? But
Well, other than the recent, the text, and I have talked to her about things, and she wouldn't volunteer something like, "Oh, this happened to me," but she remembers what we used to say, and I don't think she's ever disbelieved those things. And we both saw what we saw in the water meadows, and that was, in a place away from our home. That was probably a 20-minute drive away. We'd gone for a walk to go to the Bluebell Woods in that place.
mm-hmm.
And she now says that she remembers something, but she couldn't tell me what it was. And she does that thing where she's like, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. But I did talk to her again about it yesterday or the day before, and I said I was talking to you, and she said, "Oh no, I didn't see anything," smiling kind of thing. And then she said, "But I do remember that when we went to go to the Bluebell Woods, we didn't stay because it didn't want us, and we left."
So yeah, it's the language people use, isn't it? It's really interesting that
yes,
they're referring to something that had some kind of presence and effect on them, but it's often hard for people to marry that with the ideas that they have about what is possible in the world. And so they say, no, that didn't happen, but this is kind of how it made you feel, or this is what it was like, and it's had some kind of effect on them in some way. So what did you think you had seen when you were with your mum?
I thought it was a gnome or a pixie or some kind of fae thing. Right at the time, it's like that's all it could be. These little red trousers going up there, bright red going up the bank. Yeah. So as I said, I think in my email, if it was here, the only thing that is that red is a cardinal. Well, you don't get cardinals in Kent, do you? And it, I saw legs. I saw definite legs and little feet. This wasn't a tiny creature either. This was a bigger one, probably more like a foot tall.
Yeah.
Something like that. So
what had happened when you were walking the woods then? How did it all come about that you saw that?
When we saw it, we were actually walking in a water meadows heading towards the woods. This is an old village square and a pub and a church. And you kind of go out down one of the lanes and you come to the water meadows, and you walk along a stream. It's quite thick, wide, running stream, and it's pebble bottom in some places. And there's a little ford bit that you can cross one area. But if you keep following that stream along, you eventually come to a bridge which you can cross, and that takes you kind of up a hill into a little wooded area where where the bluebells are. And we were walking, we'd just come alongside on the opposite side of the stream to the area where the woods was. The woods itself was kind of up a little bit, like I said, on almost like a little hill. I suppose it's more like a copse.
Mm-hmm.
And something caught my attention. There was some reason there was that wind that you sometimes get, like just that, like there's a whisper on the breeze or something, and it makes you take notice. And that's when we saw the little man. Well, I'd say it's the little man. Mum's like, I don't know what it was. Kind of run up the bank. It was very long reeds, so you couldn't see a face or anything like that. And it was definitely the back of him. But I feel like the way the bank was and the stream, he must have been down there. And maybe he was fishing like a traditional gnome, or maybe he was gathering water, or maybe he was just sitting there minding his own business. And so I don't think we'd been really. Mum and I normally chat, but I don't think we had been chatting at that point. I think maybe we were just walking and just enjoying, because it's a very, very beautiful area, and he hadn't heard us coming. Maybe I don't know. We surprised him,
and that perhaps he was climbing up.
Yes,
to head off.
Yes.
Yeah.
He hadn't been able to get into, the thicker section of the undergrowth quick enough for us not to see him.
Can you time any of these happenings with anything that was ever happening in your life at those times? I know it's hard to time the ones in your younger years, but
so that was later. So that would have been it may have been around the time just before we were making the decision to move to the US, because that was a big thing, and that was a big move, and lots of things kind of went on around that time. And in fact, I did actually go to a psychic at the time, and she knew we were going to move, and it was going to be a big move before we did, which was interesting. But and she used Native American cards as well, which I thought was very interesting, because coming to America, but they obviously, she said, "Oh, I feel like using these cards today." She had all different ones, and she used those. But anyway, I digress. So it could have been a time of transition. And definitely those water meadows. They're you use their word a lot, and it's it's a liminal space, isn't it? Again, and the water and the bluebells, and I've always had this thing about bluebells. Yeah. And my friend that I used to go to the bluebells with, she'll text me and say, "I'm going to the bluebell woods, but don't worry, I won't eat anything if anyone offers me anything." I won't take anything.
Well, talking about ingesting, because it must be hard for you to be away from those bluebells. You can take. I've just popped some in my tea while we've been talking. A bluebell tincture. Now, so you can make a tincture really easily. This one I can taste that it's because usually you use sort of vodka or brandy or whatever you've got to make the tincture, but this one's made with cider vinegar, because I can taste it. But it was made by the woman who saw the fairy being at the same place as me.
Right.
And there are bluebells that grow there, and so she made the bluebell tincture from around that landscape. And when I'm speaking to people about their experiences, I will have a drop of it either on my tongue or in my tea. I'm having chamomile tea at the moment with some lemon balm from the garden in as well. So, you can easily make a tincture. I'll send you a link afterwards, because it's very...
I often do go back to the UK in April, and we, there's a bluebell woods in a garden that we Mum and I go to see. I didn't see it this year actually, because the weather was so horrible. That's maybe I should gather some bluebells in the woods we used to go to next year and make a tincture.
I think if you make it straight away and then just bring it back with you, whether you can bring it back with you.
I remember, I had forgotten the woods that I used to go to with my friend that was part of the estate. So later, what I studied at university, fine arts valuation. So I did history of art, antiques, and all that kind of stuff. And I got really into the pre-Raphaelites and Victorian fairy painting, funnily enough, became one of my things. And I bought myself a book. One of the first pages it opened on was a painting by a family member of the people that owned the estate. And she did a painting in 1905 of fairies in the woods. And I remember when that opened, I was like, she saw them too. And it's the same place. The way she depicts the fairies is very similar to the way they kind of looked on my curtains and the way I see them in my mind, kind of solid in parts, but sort of wispy as well.
Sadly, we are unable to reveal the identity of that painting because we want to protect the landscape in which these beings reside. Thanks. And I know there was something else I was going to ask you about. Oh yeah, that's right, the stick man.
Oh yes. So he was in New York. So he's recent. I've lived in this house in South Carolina for 2 years. But we were still experiencing Sticky, as my husband called him, in his various forms until we moved.
This section is available for all members of the Curious Crew who support me on Patreon. Join us there for this and more bonus content. Patreon.com/The Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast.
But I don't think anything came with us, although I did wonder whether we bought some things from my mum's house when I moved out when I was a kid into our new house.
Okay.
But I do think things that they do transfer. My mum always joked, you see, this is my mum again, who doesn't believe in those things, that I had they'd given us an old carpet from their house that was, it'd been down for years, but it was brand new. It was a room we didn't use, and it was a room that we always said, the others are in there. And she thought that my dad had rolled up the fairies in the carpet and they'd come in the carpet.
You never know.
You never know, but I don't know. Yeah, but I don't think any of the fae from New York came to South Carolina, but I definitely think there are some similar entities here. I haven't seen anything other than in my mind's eye a couple of times, and I know we've had a couple of issues, and we were doing things that whatever is here didn't really like, and I would put out honey to placate things. That always works. I don't know why. Yeah. Honey seems it's obviously very soothing, isn't it?
I do find honey helps. I've been known to leave copious amounts of honey and a big slab of butter outside for the fairies in our garden.
So in Connecticut, people would leave out butter and bread for the fairies there, because there is still quite strong kind of fairy traditions in pockets here. Saying in Connecticut, people were definitely kind of tuned into that, and that's the Hudson Valley where I lived. You've probably heard of Sleepy Hollow.
Yes.
As in Sleepy Hollow, the place is a place of legends and folklore that goes way beyond Victorian times, when I can't remember who wrote the Legends of Sleepy Hollow, but before he moved into the area and wrote his stories. In fact, he took a lot of his ideas from the old Dutch legends and things.
It was Washington Irving.
That's it. Yeah. I went to his house, and that was quite nearby, and he lived right on the river in Sleepy Hollow's beautiful house.
Fantastic.
Had this big trumpet vine that climbed all around the front of the house. It was all full of hummingbirds. And one of the mountains on the other side of the Hudson River to where we lived, that had its own little imp type creature that it was even written on the information board, the tourist information board, about this legend of this little imp that would, lure sailors in, and he would come out on his boat and lure sailors onto the rocks that way. So that, definitely people do, kind of, I don't know if they believe, but they do have these traditions, and
they have that folklore. So many amazing places to see over there, and one day I will make it over there and have a
It's such a
tour
big
around.
country. Yeah,
It
you need to do
is.
so many trips.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
we're like that,
exactly.
keep trying to see everything here, and we're still making our way around the British Isles, trying to get
Well,
to all
this
the
is it.
places.
Yeah, this is it. You're heading back and seeing home again, and be interesting to see if you see any lights this time, and maybe you could even leave an offering under the pear tree or the one of the magic trees that you
Yeah,
and your sister
the
found.
pear tree isn't the tree that I would leave an offering for, but it is. I did think it's very tempting to leave an offering at one of the trees where I used to and see if anything happens. I'm sure my mum will accompany me.
Yeah,
You always
yeah.
have to I always have to do my little I always have to go over the road and walk around the marsh and just reconnect over there for sure. So I'll take something for them.
There's
Definitely.
something really special about, maintaining that connection with the land that you grew up around and that your parents were familiar with. I mean, especially where it goes back generations. So I just created a bonus last week for the patrons, and it was exactly this. I was looking at this guy's life, who lived in Cornwall. His name was John Harris, and he was a Cornish poet. And he grew up, his family worked down the mine, and he also worked down the mine, but he loved his poetry. He would write poetry using
Oh,
blackberry juice as ink.
wow, yeah.
And on the back of paper from the grocery shop that his mother would bring the shopping home in those days.
Right.
So he was born in 1820.
Mhm.
And he would write about how he felt about the landscape around him, and some stories about how his grandmother would relate, both grandmothers would relate to the landscape, whether they went collecting herbs or whether they would call upon the land in times of need, as you might perhaps, through your religious faith, visit a church. They were communing with the landscape in that way. And it was a real reminder and an eye opener about the way that we used to have this relationship with the land that we grew up around. I mean, until
Mm.
the Industrial Revolution, we didn't really leave our homesteads. I mean, lots of people did, and for good reasons as well. Not everybody, wanted to be with their families, which is fair enough. It's the same now, isn't it? But I
Yeah.
mean, we leave for other reasons now because this is what we do. We might, get work somewhere else, or we go traveling and we fall in love, meet somebody and fall in love and stay there. But obviously back, people did just stay where they were born and where their families had lived before them. And there's this kind of relationship that builds up then between you and the land. And it sounds like, you're lucky in that you still have maintained that connection with the land. It's a very precious one.
Yes, yeah, no, definitely have, and I do feel at home here, and I feel I've made a lot of connections with the land and the nature that surrounds me here. But there is definitely a going home and a connecting with
Yeah.
home.
I hope your trip goes really well.
Thank you, and yes, I'll let you know if I hear anything or see anything, or whether they're annoyed with me for sharing their secrets. But I don't think they will be.
Time to renovate, transmutate. Time to renovate.
Huge thanks again to our guest for sharing these wonderful experiences. They are a great reminder of how important it is to hold on to that magic of childhood throughout our lives. Of course, it's a great privilege to be able to run wild and free in rural landscapes as children, which provides all the more opportunity for encounters. Though it does seem that children, if allowed to, appear to be able to lose themselves in play and enter other states where they experience various phenomena in any surroundings. As we're increasingly finding by speaking to our guests, this is not as unusual as our modern frameworks of understanding would lead us to believe. My personal belief is that it's innate within us and largely socialized out of us, so that we eventually associate ourselves exclusively with material existence and regard all other personal experience of the self in alternative states of being as imaginary or hallucinatory. There's so much to look at here, and I'll be returning to some of these themes in later episodes because they warrant further research. We'll start with the flying or levitation experience. As so often happens, a great deal of synchronicity rose up around this subject, if you pardon the pun, as I was editing this episode. Firstly, my friend and colleague Dr. Simon Young released an episode on levitation on his excellent podcast Boggart and Banshee, which I would recommend listening to. And just yesterday I spoke with a man who experienced flying as a child in the Appalachian Mountains where he visited. This episode will release soon. A number of the guests I have spoken to so far also hold childhood memories of flying. The consensus is, of course, that it's either imagined or that it's astral travel, mistaken for physical flying. However, those of us who do remember the ability to do this can remember actually lifting off the ground and hovering, often being able to move at will, vertically and horizontally. There are many famous cases of saints being able to levitate, including St. Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, who rose from the ground before his death, St. Francis of Assisi, Thomas Aquinas, and most documented of all, St. Joseph of Cupertino, who entered deep trances and was witnessed numerous times to rise before images of the Virgin Mary. On one occasion this occurred in the presence of Pope Urban VIII. This particular case is explored in the Boggart and Banshee episode. Later documented accounts include Anne Catherine Emmerich, a German vestry nun who in the early 19th century experienced stigmata phenomena and was said to have held the power to fly up to the higher parts of the church and clean the ornaments up there. Aside from saints and ecstatic trances, this subject isn't usually taken seriously or documented, though I very much enjoyed reading the many accounts from ordinary citizens on Reddit. It's a mine of information sometimes, isn't it? These shares mirror the descriptions of people that I've spoken to personally, and my own experience of flying down the stairs on numerous occasions as a young child. Here's a few from Reddit. Sounds like BS, and most people I've told think it was a dream, but I'm 100% sure it really happened. This happened when I was around 5 or 6 and we had just moved into our new house. Note the transition there. I was stood at the bottom of the stairs and had my hand on the banister, which was very high up, and I could only just reach it. I would not have been strong enough to lift myself off the ground, and there was no one else downstairs to lift me. But I remember I just floated up above the ground, and I wasn't scared or even slightly alarmed, but I was doing it myself, and I didn't feel as though I was being lifted. All my family was upstairs or outside. When I heard my mother open her bedroom door, I just stopped floating. I came back down to the ground, and that was that. To this day, I have no theories about why that happened or what it was. If anyone has any ideas, I'd greatly appreciate them. And this next one. It's crazy how common this experience is. I've posted about this before, but when I was 5 or 6 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night, got out of bed, walked down the hall to the top of the stairs, and gently alighted from the top of the stairs to the bottom. It must have been a dream, but it does not reside in my memory as a dream. I remember it as something that actually happened. I floated down the stairs. In fact, I remember the aftermath, going into the family room and looking around, coming back upstairs, going into the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror, getting back in bed, etc. Mundane stuff that typically would not be part of a dream. And someone else notes, same thing happened to me. Only difference was I was at the top of the stairs when I started floating down. And this was my own personal experience as well, which happened a number of occasions where I would be at the top of the stairs and I could will myself to hover above the stairs rather than step down them. And that was something that I did on numerous occasions between the ages of, say, 3 and 4. I would love to hear from any listeners who remember the ability to do this or may still experience this, and if you're interested in the subject, I can also recommend listening to a bonus episode on Spirit Box podcast about the Flying Men sect in rural Haiti. Now, moving on to fairies and lights in trees. We've heard from previous guests that in childhood they witnessed fairies in their gardens, in trees and around flowers. If you're interested in this, you can hear previous shares at episode 39, Glorious Creatures, and episode 17, Red-Winged Warrior. There are some great submissions on this theme in Simon Young's Fairy Census. I am a reception class teacher who regularly takes my class to a local park where we have a forest school type session to a woodland area. With a group of children, we were examining the exposed roots of a small tree that had been blown down in a storm the previous day. Someone began to hit the root network with a stick, and a boy cried, "Look, fairies! Fairies are coming out!" I asked him what they looked like, and he pointed to the air around us, describing, just little, like tiny lights. As we were looking, and I could see nothing, another boy came over to the tree, looked around, laughed and said, "Oh, fairies!" Both boys were clearly looking at the same thing, which I couldn't see. I was, however, convinced that something had emerged from the disturbed tree roots because 2 different children had witnessed it independently. Perhaps we were destroying their home. I was in a field not far from my grandma's house, visiting for the day, saw several lights in and about a hedge. I walked up to the hedge and the lights started to fade. I also thought I could hear tinkling sounds. My gran told me she could always hear them. Not sure if fairy, but definitely something wanted to attract me to them. The lights in the hedge. This is from a female in Derbyshire, England in the 1960s, sometime up to the age of 10. And the forest school was submitted by a male in the northeast of England in the 2010s, and the boys were some age up to the age of 10. I love the bedroom visitation that our guest shared. We've heard a number of these now from our previous guests, most notably in episode 10, Stay or Go, episode 31, Arrival of the Fairy Host, and 59, The Burgundy Kingdom. Our guest finds that she cannot quite believe her eyes, and yet when she tells her father, he does of course try and comfort her by saying that it's just been a dream, which he maintains to this day, and yet she maintains this very real memory of this actually happening. And this is understandable. A parent will not want to place any fear upon their children, and quite frankly, they can't explain it. And so it's their compassion for their child in this state of shocked awareness that they are unable to assist with, that they comfort their children in this way. But perhaps if you're listening to this and, like me, you have children who tell you about their dreams and experiences, you can encourage this wonderment to continue by really talking to them about their experiences, maybe even getting them to write it down or draw a picture. And if they are genuinely frightened by anything that they see at night, then, encourage them to address that by perhaps drawing a symbol of something that they believe will stop those visitations from happening, helping them to create some kind of area in their bedroom where they will feel protected, whether that's a picture of a saint or deity that you choose to relate to as a family, or whether you may use crystals that you feel will place protection, or some kind of other traditional symbols like a horseshoe, or, as I say, something that is drawn or created by your child, which I feel is most powerful because it's also encouraging them to realize that all of the answers lie within them, and that if they would like to address something, to reach within themselves and find for themselves what it is that will protect them, because that will work for them. If they believe it to be so, that will work for them. So there are lots of different ways of approaching this, and if you want to know more about this, you can also contact me. Here are some similar shares from the fairy census. At the time I was, I think, around 5 to 6 years old, maybe a bit older. In my bedroom was a wooden playbox which I was very afraid of. The reason for this was I would often hear voices coming from inside the box, and these voices belonged to very tiny men, a bit like gnomes who would come and go from the box. This happened over a period of time, and I heard them often. I can still recall the voices, but in describing the men, I am not at all sure now. I heard them far more than seeing anything. After moving, the house box was no longer in my room, and I never heard voices coming from it again. I still don't like the box. It's now a blanket box and in my dad's house. I cannot remember ever saying anything about this to anyone else. I really can't remember their appearance apart from them being very small and gnome-like. I saw a parade of fairies going across my bedroom floor. They were all dressed in finery and had musical instruments and tiny animals. I tried to wake up my sister and shook her, but she would not wake up. I had another experience when I was in my 40s. I was lying on my bed in the middle of the afternoon, and there was a puff of green smoke on my wall, and then there was an opening and a tiny green man came out. He was bigger than the first ones. This guy was quite ugly and about 2 feet tall. He touched my foot and ran back into the wall, which then promptly shut. I was approximately 8 to 9 years old when a band of fairy creatures flew in through my open bedroom window and danced along my duvet by my face. I was wide awake and both fascinated and scared. These fairies were nothing like the Enid Blyton and Tinker Bell style that I'd seen in books. They did have wings, barely visible and white or grey, very long thin limbs and feet. I felt they wanted me to go with them. Scared, I screamed for my mother. When she entered the room, the fairies stopped dancing, looked at her, and then flew out the window again. She didn't see them, but believed me completely, and also remembers that night to this day, nearly 40 years later. I believe and respect the Fae, and now, as a practicing Wiccan, I believe this was possibly my first calling to the occult. The blanket box one is from a female in the northeast of England. It took place in the 1970s, under 10 years old. And that second one was a female in Pennsylvania in the 1960s, between the ages of 1 and 10. The third one, it took place in Kent in England in the 1970s, sometime up to the age of 10. The multiple witness sighting in the hedgerow is also fascinating to me. Our guest describes how both she and her mother noted this strange occurrence at the time, although her mother was later reluctant to entertain the idea that it was a fairy. Again, it's not that unusual for people to spot fairy folk in the hedgerows. I had done a deep meditation at home and then went for a walk with my dog. We went down a path bordering a field to one side and a woodland to the other. After a short distance, I was aware of movement in the grass to my right. Ozzy, my dog, never reacted. I looked, expecting to see a hedgehog perhaps, but quite clearly saw a very small person. Elf? About 8 inches high, with a green jacket and small pointed hat. He, 99% sure it was a he, was walking away from me. I lost him in the grass, which was also about 8 inches high. I went back later with my wife and couldn't find the grassy patch. Very, very odd. I have also seen a fairy, but that was about 12 years ago. Also very odd. That time, my dog Poppy also saw it. I was walking home one night when a rustle began in a hedgerow to my right. Being from the country, I put it down to a badger or fox out hunting. That thought soon fled when the rustling followed my every step. I increased my pace, so did my unseen friends. I got really worried when, on encountering a gateway in the hedgerow, the rustling transferred to the other side of the road. By now I was petrified, but pig-headed enough not to show it. My companion followed me for another half-mile. Then came the part I will never forget. The hedgerow rose above the road to about my shoulder height. It became sparse, thin, more barbed wire than foliage. I turned my head sideways, and there, blotting out the stars, was a shape about 3 feet tall. It was bulky at the waist, wide at the shoulders. If it was looking at me, I could not tell, but it stood for a moment, as I did, before I ran the last mile home. If it followed me, I cannot tell, for the blood was thrumming in my ears. When I reached my house, I collapsed in at the door. My older brother was up, and he saw my state. He still says to this day that my hair was standing on end. And that first sighting was from a male in Staffordshire, England, and that took place in the 2010s when they were between the ages of 51 and 60. And that last submission was from a male in County Cavan in Ireland. Took place in the 1980s when they were between the ages of 11 to 20. Absolutely fascinating accounts, and thank you to Simon Young for giving us permission to share these. First-hand accounts are invaluable in helping us to see that these experiences, far from being unusual, are happening fairly regularly in people's lives, much more regularly than we imagine them to be. Why don't we talk about them? A lot of the time it's a fear of ridicule. In many cases we have censored ourselves from talking about subjects which may place us in some kind of bracket apparently reserved for those who are thought to be deranged for speaking of such things or believing in the existence of these beings when we have seen them face to face. We are told that because we cannot offer any material proof, we should disregard such occurrences as imagination or hallucinations. Yet what is becoming more and more clear to me through these conversations with people is that the way we currently live our lives in modern Western society, and for the last 300 years, has increasingly been at odds with our true nature as human beings on this beautiful planet Earth that we call home. It seems to me, and many others, in fact, that what is deranged is the materialistic reductionist viewpoint which we force upon ourselves through socialization, exercising natural affiliation with spirits or non-human beings, unless they fall into an approved religious system. And even then, we are usually strictly bound to enter into communion via an official representative. That, dear listener, in my opinion, is the illusion, because the truth is that each and every one of us is connected to this planet, each other, and the spirit world or other world, wherever these beings dwell. We all have a part to play in taking care of this earth, and an important part of that is communing with it. And perhaps that's what we are coming into contact with through these encounters, some kind of aspect of the spirit of the earth. Or perhaps it truly is an other world where beings are able to live in the non-material. Either way, the relationship we hold with these seen and unseen beings is a natural part of being human. We can observe this in our children. It is real, available, and accessible. It is free of limitations, only those which we impose upon ourselves, and we can also free ourselves from the judgment of others simply by deciding that it's more important to be true to ourselves, whatever others think, because we gain so much more when we return to our original nature as humans interconnected with this planet and all its beautiful mysteries. We may then reach a state of contentment because we're not trying to fit our understanding of this world or ourselves into some kind of contorted form to make it acceptable to others. When we do that, we lose ourselves, and we still don't truly feel seen anyway, because we know it's only the manufactured versions of ourselves which we're showing. So I offer these stories to you, and I invite you to step outside of any limitations which you impose upon yourself or have been allowing others to impose upon you. And I welcome you to a space that's always been within you, where you may explore freely, be yourself, and remain ever curious.